Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by RJ Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Have you ever, tried to just outthink a bad mood?
Oh, constantly. I think we all do.
Right. You know the exact feeling. You wake up, there's this heavy, unexplainable cloud hanging over you. And instead of just, experiencing it, you immediately start treating it like a complex math problem.
Yeah, you sit on the edge of the bed and interrogate yourself.
Exactly. You're like, well, I slept a full 8 hours. I had a nutritious dinner. My relationships are totally fine. There is absolutely no logical reason for me to be sad right now.
And yet, despite that flawless, bulletproof logic, you were still profoundly in a funk.
Totally. Or, maybe you've been on the other end of the spectrum trying to use sheer brute force logic to figure out your life's ultimate purpose.
Oh, the endless pros and cons lists.
Yes. You optimize your schedule, you write it all out, and you still end up feeling, more lost and paralyzed than when you started.
It is an incredibly common, almost universal experience. We instinctively try to logic our way out of deep feelings.
Yeah.
Or, conversely, we try to feel our way out of strictly logical problems. And when that strategy inevitably fails, our default reaction is to assume we just aren't trying hard enough.
Or worse, that something is just fundamentally broken within us.
Exactly.
But what if the problem isn't you at all? What if the problem is simply that you are using the completely wrong tool for the job? Welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. We've been digging through an amazing stack of sources. You sent us articles, research notes, excerpts regarding the Psychological Architecture Project.
Yeah, this is a comprehensive body of work by Professor RJ Starr. He's an independent psychology educator and scholar.
And our mission today is to really extract the most critical insights from Starr's foundational framework for understanding the human mind. Because honestly, once you see this blueprint, it explains exactly why we get so unbelievably stuck when we mix up our internal toolkit.
It truly is a blueprint for the human experience. To set the stage for you listening, Starr has formalized this massive undertaking in a conceptual monograph.
That's version 1.0, right?
Right. Psychological Architecture version 1.0. And he has a core book alongside it called The Psychology of Being Human.
Okay, great.
But it's important to clarify right at the outset what Starr is actually doing here. He isn't a licensed clinician.
Right, so he's not taking patients.
Exactly. He isn't writing this to diagnose specific psychiatric illnesses or to prescribe medical treatments. As an independent scholar, he is zooming out to do something much broader.
Okay.
He's attempting to provide a structural map of human experience. He really wants to show us the architectural blueprint of how we actually function on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can look at the blueprint for the house, we kind of need to understand why the House of Modern Psychology is currently, at least according to Starr's work, a little bit chaotic.
It is a bit disjointed, yeah.
So why do we even need this new architecture in the first place?
Well, what's fascinating here is Starr's central critique of contemporary psychology. He's very quick to acknowledge that modern psychology produces extraordinary, brilliant insights.
Sure.
I mean, we know more about cognition, about affect, about neurological development than at any point in human history. But the field tends to treat these areas as completely discrete, isolated territories.
Like they're completely separate things.
Exactly. You have cognitive researchers in one wing of the university, emotion researchers in another wing, and then, the meaning and philosophy scholars are in a totally different building across campus.
Which is great for publishing very specific academic papers, but in our actual lived experience, as the person just trying to get through a stressful Tuesday at the office, these things don't happen in isolation.
No, they don't.
They're happening all at once. I am thinking about a deadline, I'm feeling anxious about my boss, remembering that I'm supposed to be a competent professional, and questioning why I even took this job, all in the exact same millisecond.
Right, and that is precisely where psychological architecture comes in as the organizing solution. Starr explicitly states that he is not trying to invent new, confusing terminology.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, he isn't multiplying explanations or giving us a new dictionary of jargon to memorize. Instead, his entire focus is on what he calls structural location.
Structural location. meaning figuring out where exactly an experience is occurring within our overall system. Like, I'm picturing an analogy here. It's kind of like trying to understand a beautiful symphony by isolating the tuba in one room and the violins in another.
That's a great way to look at it.
Star's architecture puts us back in the concert hall to see how the music is actually made all together.
Exactly. Because if you don't know where an experience is happening structurally, you won't know how to address it. You will apply the wrong intervention to the wrong part of yourself.
So to fix this, we have to look at the load-bearing pillars that actually hold the building up. In Starr's framework, there are 4 of these pillars. He calls them the 4 irreducible domains. Let's walk through these because this is like the absolute core of the whole blueprint.
Definitely. And as we walk through these 4 structural dimensions, it is crucial to keep one of Starr's cardinal rules in mind. These domains are interdependent, but they're absolutely not interchangeable.
Not interchangeable, meaning they all have specific jobs.
Right. You cannot swap one out for another to do the same job. So the first domain is mind.
And when Starr says mind, we aren't just talking about the physical, biological brain, are we?
No, mind in this architecture refers to how experience is processed. This domain handles your perception, your attention, your interpretation of events.
Okay, so it's the logic center.
Basically, it's the machinery that allows you to simulate future scenarios and construct narratives. The mind organizes your raw experience into an intelligible, readable form. But, and this is a massive qualifier, the mind does not determine what actually matters to you. It's just a processor.
Okay, so the mind just processes the data. It's an organizer. But if the mind doesn't decide what matters, what actually flags something as important?
That brings us to the second domain, which is emotion. Emotion concerns how experience is felt, and crucially, how it is prioritized. Emotion is the domain that establishes salience.
Salience.
Yes, it signals threat, attachment, loss, and care.
So it's the domain that grabs you by the collar and says, hey, pay attention to this right now.
Exactly. And here is a critical insight from the text. Emotion establishes this salience before explanation even kicks in. It conditions the very interpretive field in which your cognition operates.
Wait, so the feeling comes before the thought?
Yes. Think about walking into a room where 2 people were just arguing. You feel the heavy, awkward tension in the room viscerally, like in your body, long before your mind has had time to construct a narrative or gather evidence to explain why the tension is there. Emotion arrives first.
That is so true. You feel the danger of a car swerving into your lane before you cognitively process the make and model of the car. Okay, so emotion flags the immediate urgency, and mind processes the details. But what connects that isolated, urgent moment on a Tuesday to my ongoing sense of who I am? How do I know this is happening to me over the long haul?
That is the exact function of the third domain, identity. Identity concerns how experience is owned and stabilized across time.
Okay.
It's the domain where you consolidate your memories, your social roles, and your relational recognition into a coherent, ongoing narrative of self.
So it's the thread that connects the person I was 5 years ago to the person sitting here right now. It gives me continuity.
It provides necessary continuity, yes. However, Starr warns that identity has a shadow side.
Ooh, what's the shadow side?
It can harden into rigidity when it becomes misaligned with reality. If your identity is strictly built around the narrative, I am the person who never ever fails, that rigid continuity is going to cause a massive structural collapse when you inevitably encounter a major failure. It can't bend, so it breaks.
Wow. Which brings up a scary thought: what happens when it does break? Or when life throws a massive, unpreventable change at us? What catches us when identity shatters?
That is where the fourth and final domain comes in, meaning. Meaning concerns how experience is integrated into a larger temporal orientation.
So it's the big picture.
Exactly. It organizes your value hierarchies, your sense of fundamental responsibility, and your ultimate direction in life.
So meaning is the domain that actually allows us to endure suffering or massive change.
It situates isolated events within a much broader horizon. Meaning is what allows for endurance and coherence across the most chaotic, disruptive changes in your life.
I want to make sure I really have this locked in because these 4 pillars are so distinct. Let me try a metaphor from the tech world and tell me if this tracks with the source material.
Go for it.
Okay. If we look at a human, like a computer system is mind, the central processor, crunching the raw data. Emotion is the emergency alert and priority system, flagging what's urgent. Identity is the specific user profile, keeping track of my personal settings and history. And meaning is the overarching operating system or code that dictates why the machine is running in the first place.
That is a very helpful shorthand to start with, especially for keeping the functions distinct.
But I hear a but coming.
Well, but if we connect this to the deeper nuance of Starr's work, we have to refine that tech metaphor slightly. Humans are deeply organic. In a computer, the processor and the user profile are completely separate, isolated lines of code. You can swap a processor out without changing the profile.
Right.
In Starr's psychological architecture, these four domains are continuously conditioning each other. Your emotion heavily influences what your mind is even capable of processing in a given moment. Your identity shapes what you find meaningful. They aren't isolated hardware components in a metal box. They are a constantly breathing, interacting ecosystem.
Ah, I see the distinction now. They are interdependent, organic parts of a whole, but they still have very specific jobs. Which brings us to what I think is the most mind-blowing practical part of these notes. What happens when we forget they have different jobs?
This is where we encounter Starr's concept of category errors and structural confusion.
Structural confusion. This feels like the trap we all fall into daily.
It is. Structural confusion happens when one domain is asked to perform the work of another domain. When you try to force a domain to do a job it structurally does not have the machinery for, the entire architecture starts to buckle under the strain.
Starr wrote a few lines in the monograph that actually stopped me in my tracks when I was reading through the notes. He states, for instance, cognitive clarity cannot metabolize unprocessed emotion.
Yeah, that's a heavy one.
It feels like a direct personal attack on my habit of making intricate spreadsheets whenever I feel overwhelmed.
It is a profound statement. And it goes right back to the opening example of trying to outthink a bad mood. Cognitive clarity. Your mind domain can give you a perfect logical explanation for why you shouldn't be sad.
Right, it can map out all the facts.
Exactly. It can draw the timeline, assess the variables. But the mind does not have the biological or psychological machinery to actually metabolize or digest an emotion. Only the emotion domain can do that through feeling and regulation.
I want to challenge this, though. Let's say I'm going through terrible grief after a loss. Sometimes reading a highly clinical, dense book about the psychology of grief actually makes me feel better. The panic goes down. Isn't that my mind domain successfully metabolizing an emotion?
It's a fantastic point, but we have to look closely at the mechanics of what is actually happening there. We have to distinguish between soothing the system and metabolizing the emotion.
Oh, interesting.
When you read that clinical book, your mind is providing predictability. It is mapping the territory. Predictability lowers the immediate panic because the threat feels less chaotic. That is incredibly useful.
So it calms things down.
Yes. But understanding the 5 stages of grief cognitively does not mean you've actually processed the visceral loss of the person. You've just used your mind to build a very nice, well-lit, organized waiting room for the grief to sit in.
Wow.
Eventually, the emotion domain still has to do the work of feeling the loss. The mind cannot do it for you.
A well-lit waiting room for the grief to sit in. That completely changes how I view my coping mechanisms. There's another quote from Starr that hits a similar note. Identity narrative cannot manufacture meaning.
Think about someone going through a midlife crisis. They might have a very strong narrative about who they are, say, a vice president of sales, a provider, a respected professional.
Right, that's their identity.
That is the identity domain doing its job of providing continuity. But if they suddenly suffer a crisis of incristed, meaning if they wake up staring at the ceiling wondering why any of it actually matters, in the grand scheme of the universe repeating, I am the VP of sales over and over, isn't going to fix the void.
Because it's a completely different domain.
Exactly. Identity cannot manufacture meaning. It's the wrong tool.
And the final combination, meaning orientation, cannot correct perceptual distortion.
This is a vital warning for anyone who leans heavily on philosophy or spirituality. You can have a profound, unshakable sense of purpose that is strong meaning. But if your mind domain is experiencing perceptual distortion.
Like what, for example?
Let's say you are clinically paranoid, or you are genuinely misinterpreting the facial expressions and intentions of your spouse during an argument. All the cosmic meaning in the world won't magically fix your skewed perception. You have to address the mind domain directly to correct the data processing.
So when we commit a category error, when we try to use a spreadsheet to process grief or a job title to find the meaning of life, Starr is saying this effort actually makes things worse.
It exhausts you. When structural boundaries blur, your mental effort skyrockets, but your actual integration weakens. You are burning massive amounts of energy running in a hamster wheel.
Just spinning and spinning.
Exactly. When you commit a category error, You are working incredibly hard to stay exactly where you are. Distinguishing these domains isn't about dividing yourself into pieces. It's about clarifying your alignment so that true integration is possible.
Okay, so if blurring the domains causes our architecture to break down and waste all this energy, how do we actually build resilience? How do we use this map to stop running in the hamster wheel? This transitions us in the source material from where life happens, the domains, to how it is sustained under pressure.
Right. In Starr's framework, the domains are the where. But across those domains, we have to actively develop what he calls capacities.
Capacities.
Yes, these are the specific skills, muscles, and tolerances that allow the entire system to handle pressure without committing a category error.
The notes mention several capacities: regulatory tolerance, attentional stability, and narrative flexibility. But what do those actually look like in practice? Let's take regulatory tolerance.
Okay, so imagine you are sitting in a meeting, and a colleague harshly critiques a project you poured your soul into. Your emotion domain instantly spikes with shame and anger.
Naturally.
A low regulatory tolerance means you can't handle that spike, so you immediately commit a category error. You deploy your mind to viciously attack their logic, or you deploy your identity to loudly remind everyone of your past successes.
You react using the wrong tool because you just can't sit with the feeling.
Exactly. Regulatory tolerance is the capacity to sit in that chair, feel the heat of the emotion, and hold it without immediately demanding that the mind or identity solve the discomfort.
That makes total sense. And what about narrative flexibility?
That directly counters the rigid identity we discussed earlier. Narrative flexibility is the capacity to update your story of who I am when new data arrives without feeling like you are dying.
Oh, wow.
It's the ability to say, I'm a successful professional, but I also failed at this specific venture, and both can be true without my identity collapsing.
This is so practical. Now, when these capacities are tested, or when they fail, Starr cite notes that we fall into recurring structural patterns. The sources list several specific models: the emotional avoidance loop, the identity collapse cycle, the self-perception map, and the emotional maturity index.
Yeah, these are fascinating models.
Can we unpack the mechanics of how these actually work? Let's start with the emotional avoidance loop. How does that mechanically function between the domains?
The emotional avoidance loop is a perfect example of a chronic category error. Here is the mechanic you're in. Your emotion domain fires a signal, say a deep, pervasive anxiety about the future.
Okay.
But your identity feels threatened by being anxious. It views anxiety as weakness. So identity refuses to own the feeling and instead delegates the problem to the mind. The mind immediately starts obsessively researching the anxiety, reading articles, or planning a perfectly optimized daily routine to supposedly eliminate it.
So the mind is running 1,000,000 miles an hour trying to fix it.
Precisely. But here is the trap. The emotion domain is still sitting there, completely unfelt and unmetabolized, holding the original anxiety. Because the emotion hasn't been allowed to process and signal the all clear, the mind just keeps spinning endlessly. The mind is trying to bypass the emotion, resulting in a loop of exhaustion.
That is painfully relatable. What about the identity collapse cycle?
The identity collapse cycle happens when a person's identity domain is entirely propped up by a single external factor, like a career or a specific relationship.
Okay, I can see where this is going.
Right. When that career unexpectedly ends, the identity loses its entire basis for continuity. It fractures. Now, if they have a robust meaning domain, meaning can catch them. It provides a broader horizon that says your life still has ultimate value.
But if they don't?
If their meaning domain is undeveloped, there's nothing to catch the fall. The emotion domain is then utterly overwhelmed by the free fall of threat, and the entire structural configuration collapses into despair.
It's like a building where a load-bearing pillar is removed, and the remaining pillars just aren't strong enough to hold the roof.
That's exactly it.
And the self-perception map.
That maps how your identity views your other domains. Does your identity trust your emotion? Or does it view emotion as an enemy to be suppressed? Does your identity over-rely on your mind? It maps the internal politics of your architecture.
Wow, the internal politics.
Right.
And finally, the emotional maturity index.
This is essentially Starr's metric for structural bandwidth. Emotional maturity in this framework isn't about being perfectly calm all the time. It is the capacity to hold conflicting domains like a terrified emotion domain and a highly logical mind domain in the same space without forcing a premature panic resolution.
Which actually answers my biggest question about all of this. The ultimate goal here isn't to achieve some kind of architectural perfection, is it? We aren't trying to reach a state of flawless, static enlightenment where our domains never clash.
Starr is incredibly clear on it. This structural maturity is absolutely not about perfection. That state is a myth.
Thank goodness, because just trying to maintain this house sounds exhausting enough.
It is impossible to be perfect. Instead, maturity is about increased bandwidth and alignment. It is about having the capacity to notice when you're slipping into an emotional avoidance loop.
Right.
It's the ability to pause and say, my emotion domain is overwhelmed right now, and I'm trying to use my mind domain to spreadsheet my way out of it. I need to stop, feel the salience of this threat, and regulate rather than overthinking.
It's the ability to look at your own internal house and know which room is actually on fire, rather than just running around pulling alarms in empty hallways.
Exactly. Distinguishing these domains clarifies your alignment. And when your domains are aligned and doing their proper jobs, true psychological integration is possible.
This has been such an illuminating deep dive. To summarize the core of these sources for you listening, Professor RJ Starr's Psychological Architecture Project isn't about memorizing complex clinical terms. It's about understanding the 4 irreducible domains of your lived experience: mind, emotion, identity, and meaning. The practical takeaway here is something you can use today. The next time you feel completely stuck, overwhelmed, or paralyzed, stop and ask yourself, which of the 4 domains is actually crying out for help right now? And critically, make sure you aren't committing a category error by sending the wrong domain to do the rescue work. Do not send your mind to do your emotions job.
Absolutely. And if this structural, deliberate approach to human psychology appeals to you, Starr actually writes a newsletter mentioned in the resources called Stay in the Room.
Oh, right.
It is described as quiet writing and infrequent emails. That pace seems perfectly fitting for the kind of slow, careful integration work we've been unpacking today.
Stay in the room. I love that title. It perfectly captures the idea of regulatory tolerance not running away into a different domain when the feelings get tough.
It really does. And as we wrap up, if we connect this architecture to the much bigger picture, this raises an important lingering question that I want to leave you to ponder on your own.
Let's hear it.
Throughout this deep dive, we've been applying this blueprint on an individual level. We know that meaning is the domain that helps us endure change, and that emotion requires visceral processing, not just data. But what happens when an entire society commits a collective category error?
Oh, wow.
Think about our heavily digital, hyper-connected, information-obsessed modern world. Are we collectively experiencing profound structural crises of meaning and emotion, but trying to solve them by relying almost entirely on our collective mind?
Yeah.
We throw endless data, hot takes, logic, and infinite streams of information at our cultural pain. If we are trying to logic our way out of a collective emotional crisis, how long can our societal psychological architecture hold up before the whole structure cracks?
That is a heavy but deeply necessary question. Are we trying to outthink a cultural bad mood? We'll leave you to ponder that one. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into your sources, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by RJ Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.